All right, thanks everybody for joining me to the 5th installment of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab Spatial Data Science webinar series. This is really the culmination of a lot of the work that we've been doing over the past few webinars. We're putting together information on ecological patterns and processes from remote sensing. And we're linking it up with field data or other ground truth data to make maps of things that we're interested in. And I'm pretty jazzed about this. But before we dive into the spatial prediction side of things, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that this is the 5th in planned 6 seminars. So we're about 3/4 of the way done with the series for the year. I will say keep your eyes open both for the last webinar that's coming up in April, as well as a survey that we're going to send out pretty soon that's going to get us feedback from the community on these webinars. We anticipate we're probably going to do something like this again, but we want to make sure that it's meeting people's needs and as strong as it can be. So keep your eyes open for that, and I hope that people can join us for the next webinar coming up in April. April's webinar is really about spatial data resources that are specific to my study area in Western Colorado. I've been working a lot on assembling satellite data, LiDAR data into really detailed atlas of the Upper Gunnison Basin, and I wanted to share some of those data sets as well as some applications for doing spatial ecology work. So that should be really fun. Okay. So today's outline is very similar to the other webinars I've done. Roughly is going to go why, what, and how. The questions I'm going to try and answer are these. So why should you use your field data to make maps? Why should you try and extrapolate from your field sites to the broader landscape? We're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that are involved in there. What makes spatial prediction a unique challenge or unique set of challenges? We're going to talk about some core concepts that you really know to be successful in spatial prediction. And we're going to go over what is a very general basic workflow for this kind of work, and it should apply in lots of different situations. We're going to talk about some missteps, certainly some mistakes that I've made in my work and mistakes that I see in the production and also the use of some of these data sets. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time on a case study trying to predict vegetation deciduousness in the Upper Gunnison Basin in Western Colorado from aerial imagery and LiDAR data. So my presentation should be about 40 minutes, and then the interactive should take about that long. If you have to duck out after the presentation, just know that the recording is going to be up on YouTube within a couple of hours of us being done. So without further ado, I'm going to get cranking here. So why should you use your field data to make maps? So I think there's a couple of reasons, but one of the most compelling to me is that essentially nobody cares what's going on in your field sites, right? They care about the broader processes at work. And sometimes the best way to understand the magnitude of change or the magnitude of process is by using maps to scale up. So this is an example of people using remote sensing to estimate the consequences of the ongoing California drought. This paper is from 2016, but it's still really current work. So what they did was use remote sensing to correlate spectral properties of forests to the amount of water that was in the forest canopies. And they used a variety of different approaches to scale up to the whole state of California. If you can imagine like trying to just use this, trying to make a map kind of like this using field data alone, you'd end up having to send a survey crew essentially out to every pixel on the landscape in the entire state, and that just wouldn't ever happen. So instead, what they did was visit a representative set of sites that allowed them to come up with correlations between canopy water content and spectral features of the forest. And then they use those spectral features to then map the canopy water content across the whole landscape. And that allows us to understand the sort of broader scale consequences of drought for forest resources and agriculture and all sorts of stuff. So another reason why you might want to make maps from field data is if you don't have all the covariates you need everywhere. So a great example of that is with climate data. So this is a map from the USA National Phenology Network that shows accumulated growing degree days in the United States so far this spring. And I just wanted to point out, there is not this is based on weather station data for the most part, but there is not a weather station in each individual 4-kilometer pixel in the, on this map. Instead, what they're doing is creating a spatial prediction from interpolating between the weather station locations using an elevation map and also using some other information like weather forecasting models. But ultimately, this is a really useful product because if you are anywhere on this map, you can get an estimate of growing degree days. So you can think about that on a smaller scale. If you've got instruments out in the field that are kind of expensive that measure microclimate, but you want to get estimates at all of your sites, even the ones that weren't instrumented, you might want to do some spatial prediction kind of like this to get better estimates. So these kinds of spatial predictions can also be really useful for guiding field work. And the biggest application that I see in this world is with species distribution modeling. And that's useful both in a conservation context, because it allows us to make predictions about where, for example, rare species might be in nature. And it also has consequences for things like invasive species control. So this is a really cool project from southern Wyoming, where they've used remote sensing, in this case satellite data, to map cheatgrass across a large preserve in large prairie preserve. And cheatgrass, of course, is a highly invasive European weedy grass that has invaded a lot of habitats in the Western United States and altered fire regimes and crowded out sage grouse and done a lot of other naughty stuff. So what they've actually done here is use that predicted map of cheatgrass cover to prioritize their management. So the polygons there that are in the black outline were areas that they sprayed from the air, and they wouldn't have been able to target those locations specifically if they didn't have a map of where to look. It's something that's really hard to do from the ground. So this is another example of using spatial prediction to push forward, in this case, a management goal. But I think to me, the things that are most exciting about making maps from field data is that they really focus us on pattern process relationships. So I'm a landscape ecologist by trade, and that means that I'm really interested in how ecological patterns influence ecological processes and vice versa. So a good example of that would be the processes that are going on at alpine tree line. So this is a set of maps. On the left-hand side is an aerial photograph of an area of the Upper Gunnison Basin that's right where the forest kind of transitions into the alpine zone. And you can see those bands of trees that are going kind of from the top right of this image to the lower left. And if you overlay this map on a spatial prediction of snow depth for this area, you can start to understand some of the processes that give rise to this banded vegetation pattern. It turns out that these trees are acting in some cases as windbreaks, and that causes snow to build up behind them and really inhibits regeneration of conifers in those snowdrift environments, which in turn reinforces that banded vegetation pattern. Really, really cool pattern process relationships going on at tree line. This is just one example of the kinds of insights that you can gain if you decide to put your data on a map. So this is not all gravy, though. There are a lot of really unique challenges that are associated in making maps from field data, and I'm going to talk about a few of those. The first is just the volume of data. Even when our field data sets are not huge, anytime we start to use imagery as predictors, we run into issues of data volume. So this is just an image taken from my cell phone camera of a wonderful young fawn hanging out near Gothic in Colorado. And so this is an ordinary picture, and so it's kind of hard to remember that this is actually a massive data set. So we've got, in this case, over 3,000 rows, over 4,500 columns. And if we've got red, green, and blue information, we have 3 different spectral bands. And if you put all that together, that is 47 million values. If you can imagine that as your Excel spreadsheet of field data, that is an amazingly large data set. So we're going to have to deal with those large data volumes anytime we use imagery to make predictions across a large extent. Incidentally, of course, these 47 million values are, they're easy to move around and manipulate because this image is a JPEG. It's highly compressed. But when we're using imagery for spatial prediction, for the most part, we're going pixel by pixel, which means that there are no shortcuts like this. Another challenge here is interpolation and extrapolation. So because the places where we have field data are relatively small and the landscapes we want to predict on are really large, inevitably we're going to be predicting in areas that we don't have great representation in the field data. And that can be true both in an interpolation context where field samples are far apart geographically or sort of in feature space. And also extrapolation. So it's actually really hard to cover all the possible environments in which you want to predict with field data. So inevitably, there's both interpolation and extrapolation going on whenever you're doing spatial prediction. The consequence of that is that it's going to highlight that the world is full of what are called corner cases, right? So we all know that goats typically hang out on the ground in pasture, right? So if we're trying to train a machine learning model to recognize a goat, one good rule might be look for the areas that are near pasture. But that doesn't take into account that sometimes there are goats in trees. This is just like kind of a whimsical example, but the real world is full of these kinds of corner cases, unusual situations where we're never going to have enough field data to cover. And we just have to keep in mind that there's always going to be some surprising configurations of the world that our models are not going to deal well with. And goats and trees are just one example of that. I'll actually show you another example that's a little bit more relevant to our spatial prediction task in a minute. Finally, the challenge that I'll talk about is dealing with uncertainty. So typically these maps are made at a particular spatial scale with a particular training data set. So this is a map from a data set called soil grids, which gives gridded maps of soil properties. In this case, this is the percent, I think, silt in soils all across the world. And it's using a very sophisticated machine learning approach that assimilates topography data and satellite data with tens of thousands of data from tens of thousands of soil pits distributed all across the world. And this is awesome at a global scale. Things like silt fraction can be predicted using this remote sensing spatial prediction approach quite well. So this is a scatter plot of the measured silt fraction versus the predicted silt fraction on held out data. And the R squared there is about 0.8, meaning that the predictions accounting for about 80% of the variability across this whole gradient. So that's great, but if you're thinking about applying this in any particular sub-region of the globe, then you're going to have to deal with the fact that these relationships are probably not going to be as tight as at a local scale as they are at a global scale. For example, percent silt in soils in my domain of Colorado tend to be between about 15 and 40%. And so if you think about cropping that scatter plot to just on the x-axis 15 through 40% and 15 through 40% on the y-axis, you can actually see that in that range, the model predicts a far lower proportion of the variability in silt. And that indicates that it's probably not as useful at a local scale as it is at a global scale. So that's just something to keep in mind. We're always going to have to deal with uncertainty. And sometimes it's going to be, and actually often it's going to be hard to figure out what that uncertainty is in any particular location within our study area. So even if we have a good idea of what the global accuracy of our model is, that doesn't necessarily translate to the accuracy in any one particular part of the landscape. Okay. So those are the promise and the challenge. What core concepts do we need to know to succeed here? And I'm going to talk about 5 that are pretty basic, but they're super important. The first is that the goals with spatial prediction are somewhat different than the goals of traditional statistical inference. Common questions that researchers might ask themselves if they're doing specific statistical inference on their data is like, is this pattern in the data real? Could it be an artifact of sampling variability? And if it's not, if it is real, then what's causing it? Is it a causal relationship or is there some kind of confounding going on? And a lot of the statistical tools that we have are for answering questions like this, right? But when we're making spatial prediction, our emphasis is actually a little bit different. And it's more about, is this pattern useful? Does it allow us to make successful predictions? And how stable is that relationship over space and through time? Now, obviously, those two, I guess those different questions are related to each other. For example, if a pattern is likely to be due to sampling variability, it's probably not going to be really great for making predictions. Likewise, causal relationships are probably going to be a little bit more stable over space and time than correlations that are induced by some other kind of indirect relationship. However, when we're dealing with prediction, our emphasis shifts from significance, from the mathematical form of a relationship, to just like, does this provide useful information for making it?
Oh. What'd you get? A toy.
Your microphones are off. Thanks. All right. So the next core concept that we need is to talk about features. So features is kind of a machine learning jargon for what in the statistics world we talk about predictors or covariates. These are just potentially useful things that we can use, potentially useful quantities that we can use for prediction. And there are really four discrete classes of features that you might be interested in for spatial prediction. I'm going to just go over them really quickly. The first are spectral features. So these are aspects of the landscape that are related to how much light is reflected off of the landscape at different wavelengths. So this is an infrared photograph of a tree farm in West Virginia. And one of the things you'll see is that these trees look like they have snow on them. The reason why they look like they have snow on them is they're highly reflective in the infrared, much more so than the soil that's underneath them, or even the grass that's kind of growing between the trees. And so this is a spectral feature of green vegetation. It tends to have very, very high near infrared reflectance. And different species tend to reflect differently in those infrared wavelengths. So we can use those spectral features to do things like map species in some cases, or map land cover types effectively. There's also structural features which can be useful. And these come mainly from techniques like photogrammetry and LiDAR, where we can understand a little bit more about the three-dimensional structure of vegetation. So this is a cube of LiDAR point data that's been segmented into, it looks like, half a dozen different trees. And you could take this point cloud and you could compute a bunch of different measures, like the height of the canopy, the density of the understory, things like that. And those might be useful for our prediction task as well. These are called structural features. We've got temporal features, which are related to how the landscape changes over time. One of the really easy to understand temporal features is just the progression of leaves changing color in the fall. So this is a hillside full of quaking aspen in western Colorado, and you can see this is right in the middle of transitioning from green vegetation to its beautiful golden aspen yellow color. And you can see that those mid slopes that are aspen are starting to turn, but of course the evergreen vegetation that's up on the top of the hill is remaining the same color as it ever was. So the difference in the temporal trajectory of color can give you unique information about the landscape, and that's one of the cool things that you can get from repeat remote sensing, where you've got a time series of satellite information or a time series of drone imagery. You can extract temporal features that can be really useful for prediction. The last class I'm going to talk about are geographic or semantic features. These are features that are really about spatial relationships, and they can be pretty important for certain kinds of mapping tasks. This is a little piece of an annotated data set that has different urban cover classes coded as different colors, right? So the green are trees, the gray are impervious surface, the blue are buildings. And semantic features of a landscape like this might have something to do with the proximity of those different cover classes to each other. You might find that cars tend to be located on impervious surfaces, or that buildings tend to be located within a particular distance of impervious surfaces. So those are semantic features, and there's a wide variety of them. Ranging from the spatial pattern of pixels around a particular location, all the way to things like the distance from a field sampling point. And all of those are potentially useful pieces of information for spatial prediction. Okay, next core concept is a loss function. So machine learning algorithms, for the most part, are they're adjusting a set of parameters to minimize a loss function. And you can think of loss as sort of badness or error. And what these algorithms are doing is that they're tweaking their parameters to essentially walk down a complex landscape of parameter space to find that sweet spot of minimum loss. I'm not going to go into much detail on loss functions, but there are two features that I want to really highlight here. The first is that loss functions actually encode the goals and values of an analysis. This is a formula that's just a common loss function for classification problems called cross entropy. One of the, I guess one of the goals or one of the values that equation encodes is that false positives are about as, that false positives contribute to the loss function just as much as false negatives do. And so what that's going to push is for classifications that are balanced. They have a roughly equal number of false positives and false negatives. Now, that might be good in some cases, but you can imagine some contexts in which it might be really useful to minimize, for example, the number of false negatives, and maybe you don't care so much about false positives. So you might imagine that as like back in the management context, you might want to make sure that you don't spray non-cheatgrass environments, even at the cost of missing some of those cheatgrass environments. So I would encourage you guys to dig in a little bit here and think about what are the loss functions that might be relevant to my particular problem. Now, not every function of the response variable and the predictions is a potentially legitimate loss function. Most importantly, those loss functions have to be what are called differentiable. And without going back into your calculus textbook, differentiable functions are essentially smooth, which means that small variations in the predictors, the parameters, result in small deviations in the loss. So in situations like this, where you have discontinuities, sharp angles, or step functions, those represent non-differentiable functions that unfortunately don't work very well for loss. Unfortunately, this is sort of an obtuse topic. There are a lot of very technical papers written on loss functions, but because they're so important, I encourage you guys to learn a little bit more. Okay, next concept, fitting and overfitting. So a lot of these algorithms are extremely good at minimizing loss. They are going to find every possible way to get a good prediction on the data that you're training it on. But the flip side of that is that sometimes when they get really good at making predictions on the training data, they actually sometimes get worse at making predictions on data that's independent of the training data. And that's something called overfitting. So this is a graph that you see a lot in machine learning. It's a graph of the loss as a function of the number of epochs, or the sort of like period in the training process of the algorithm. So the dots represent a decreasing loss as we train the model. And at a certain point, the validation loss, that's the loss computed on data that was held back from fitting the model, starts to level off, and it levels off far more quickly than the training loss does. And you can see it's starting to creep up a little bit after about epoch 12 and a half. So we want to be able to find the sweet spot here where we've minimized the training loss. We want to minimize the validation loss, not minimize the training loss. So in this case, we might want to stop the algorithm around epoch 10 to get the best the model that's going to predict the best on independent data. So in practice, how this is usually done is through a procedure called cross-validation. And cross-validation is simply a way of dividing your data set up in a way that allows in turn every bit of it to be part of both the training set and the testing set. So this divides your data set up into compartments or folds, usually by random, although sometimes by spatial block. And then it'll fit the model using, in this case, 4 out of the 5 blocks. And it'll leave the 5th block back for testing and then evaluate the performance based on that 5th block. And then it's going to go and do that again, but in this case, using the 4th block, and then the 3rd block, and then the 2nd block, and the 1st block. And if we average those performance scores together, then we get a pretty good idea of how the model's going to work on independent data. All right, last core concept here, precision and bias. So this is one of those things that's kind of Tolstoy-like, right? So every accurate machine learning model is both precise and unbiased, relatively so anyway. That means that it's going to give you the right answer every time. But if models are less than ideal, then they can be less than ideal in a couple of different ways. For example, they can give you exactly the wrong answer every time. That would be a situation in which you've got high precision, but also high bias. Sorry, high bias, but also high precision. You can also imagine a situation in which you've got a model that doesn't give you the right answer every time, but on average, its predictions are unbiased. That's a situation where you've got low precision, but also low bias. And then finally, you've got the worst of both worlds, where you've got a situation in which a model is giving you the wrong answer, but a variable wrong answer every time. So this is just know that the accuracy sort of has some complexity, has some components to it that we need to pay attention to. Okay, so if I were to wrap that up into sort of 3 sentences that use some of these concepts, it would be these. So machine learning models use features to learn a task and make predictions by minimizing a loss function. For the most part, they don't really care about statistical significance. They're just trying to make good predictions. And these models are really good at making predictions on training data, but they can overfit. And this means that you always want to evaluate a model on independent data, sometimes using cross-validation. And then an accurate model gives both precise and unbiased predictions. So that's sort of the core concepts that you need to know to be successful. And this is actually true, not just for geographic data or spatial prediction, but any kind of prediction task is going to use these concepts. So they're pretty important. Okay, let's talk about basic workflow here. And I'm pretty, yeah, it's surprising, as much complexity as much nuances and all these different problems, the basic workflow for statistical prediction using machine learning is actually pretty prescribed. And I'll end up reusing a lot of workflows over and over. So I wanted to go through the basic one. So it's always going to start with training data, right? So we have to go out into the field with a GPS unit and Quadrat or whatever sampling instrument we need, and collect training data. Now, sometimes we're collecting data on stuff that you can't, I guess you can only measure in the field. This would be something like soil properties or the frequency that a hummingbird visits a flower, all sorts of things that you can never see from an aerial image. Other times you can use imagery and collect your training data heads up by essentially just flying around on the aerial imagery and collecting training data. And that can actually be much more efficient than being out in the field. With the downside is that there are only a few things that you can really say for certain from an aerial image. And that depends a lot on how much field experience and skill you've got. So for example, I'm pretty good at picking willows out of an aerial photograph. But that's because I've looked at a ton of willow wetlands in air photos. So your own sort of training process affects whether you need to go out in the field or whether you can rely on imagery. Regardless, you need to go out and collect some ground truth data. The next step is assembling features or assembling a set of covariates that you can use for spatial prediction. And that, for the most part, involves some reasoning, trying to understand what are the spectral or structural or temporal or semantic features that might be useful as a prediction in this prediction task. A good example would be if I wanted to predict something about climate, like how warm or cold the air temperature is. I would immediately go to a predictor that's based on topography, because I know that there are a lot of physical processes that make it colder as you go up the hill, usually, unless you're in a cold air pool at night, in which case you might get colder as you go down the hill. Regardless, this is where your knowledge of the process really matters a lot. And this is where we need to apply all of our science, all of our process knowledge to understand what are the things that are likely to be good predictors here. Once we've assembled those features, oftentimes we have to do quite a bit of processing to get them ready to go. And that involves both resampling them to get them on a common grid, but also what's called feature engineering. And that's transforming the data to make it a little bit more suitable for modeling. That might be like log transforming it to minimize the influence of outliers. It might be centering it so the mean is 0. It might mean normalizing variables so that they're less correlated with each other. Principal components analysis. It's sort of like a lot of different feature engineering that sometimes needs to happen. But that's an important step that it would be kind of, want to make sure that I don't leave out. The other thing is that this is actually a bigger deal for machine learning than it is often with statistical inference, although sometimes it's an issue for inference as well. So regardless, we've now got training data and we've got engineered features ready to go. Essentially, this is a data set that's ready for modeling. The next step is we want to fit a baseline model. And a baseline model is something that we can relatively quickly implement to figure out where we are with respect to a prediction task we want to undertake. So the returns on modeling tend to be a little bit nonlinear. So they tend to be diminishing returns, right? So we want to figure out where we're starting to figure out where we're likely to end up. So if I go through a process where I assemble training data, I assemble features, and I fit a baseline model, and it's nowhere near as accurate as I need it to be for the task, then I'm probably going to need, sorry, that's evaluated with independent data. Then I'm probably going to need to actually go back and either collect more training data, collect more features, or just give up and go get a beer and try another project, right? So we only essentially want to pour a lot of time and effort into optimizing a prediction workflow if we've got some reasonable chance that it's going to meet our criteria, right? And so that's what a baseline model does, is it helps us to understand whether we're likely to be successful or whether we need to go back to the drawing board. So if we are sort of close to the ballpark of accuracy that we need, then we're in the position where we need to try a bunch of different approaches. And that includes maybe including different suites of potential features for a task or using different modeling approaches. Regardless, we're always going to be evaluating where we are relative to our accuracy criteria using independent data. So if everything's gone well here, then we've finally got a model or a set of models that perform really well at our task. And then now is our opportunity to actually make a map to do spatial prediction. And I've broken this out from the other steps because there tends to be quite a bit of work that needs to go into just setting up in the code for this kind of spatial prediction. This is a large scale computation often, and we need to break our domain into lots of different pieces and potentially distribute those pieces across different computers or different processing threads and assemble everything back together. But the ultimate product of this is a map, which is super exciting. Typically, we want to do some post-processing on those predictions, and that might mean clipping out parts of the study area that we don't care about. It might mean combining the predictions from a couple of different models to make an ensemble. But regardless, usually you're going to end up boosting the performance or the applicability of a model if you do some post-processing. The other thing that will inevitably happen once you think you're done, you're going to make your big map. You're going to let your computer run a couple of days to make the map. You're always going to identify some problems, and sometimes those problems are just corner cases that you can't do anything about. These are the goats in trees. A good example from my recent work is that Gunnison County has a tree dump. which is a place where people can go take their used Christmas trees and other landscaping waste. And it turns out those giant piles of Christmas trees look pretty similar to a big forest of Christmas trees. But that's just like one area, maybe a few hundred square meters in a city area that's hundreds of square kilometers. And it's just like not worth it to go back and specifically develop training data for the Gunnison tree dump. So you can either post-processing clip it out, or you can just know that there's going to be some things that you're never going to be able to quite nail down. And it's easy to get really good, but it's really hard to get perfect. Regardless, there's usually some iteration here, right? So we're going to go identify problems. We might go back to the modeling stage and tweak the models a little bit, or we might go back to the data stage and collect more training data and go through the whole process again. But the ultimate result here should be a map that meets our goals. It's fit for purpose. Okay, so that's the workflow. I want to zoom in a little bit on this fit, tune, and compare models step, because there's a lot here. And specifically, there's a ton of different statistical approaches to potentially explore. And some of these are essentially already in most scientists' toolkits. These are regression-based approaches like generalized linear models, or generalized linear mixed models, or generalized additive models. They are essentially ways of fitting linear or nonlinear functions through feature space. And they tend to have a loss function called the negative log likelihood. And that's great, but it's sort of only one little corner of the potential modeling landscape. We've also got tree-based methods like random forest and boosted regression trees. So instead of straight lines or smooth functions, these tend to fit step functions through our feature space. And that can be advantageous in a lot of ways, but it also has some problems. We've also got vector-based methods, such as support vector machines that fit essentially planes in high dimensional space to separate different categories from each other. Those I think were really ascendant about 10 years ago and have still proven very useful. I can't go through without talking about neural networks. These are models that are based on essentially analogs to neurons in a human brain that connect features to an outcome, and they use a technique called backpropagation to adjust the values of those different neurons until they get good predictions. There are a huge number of different neural network architectures out there. The ones that I find most useful in ordinary work with field data, one's called MLP, or multi-layer perceptron. There are also much deeper neural networks that have many more layers of artificial neurons than what's diagrammed here. And there are some that can learn contextual features, semantic features, and those are really useful. But they've got some problems. They're not a silver bullet. And finally, there's a whole family of more traditional geostatistical techniques. This is like techniques like Kriging or inverse distance weighted interpolation, and those are really focused on those are really focused on the semantic information, and they don't typically incorporate too many other features that are not related to the distance from a sampling site, for example. All of these different approaches have different costs and benefits to them, and I think if one of the one of the things about becoming an experienced data scientist is that you sort of get a little bit of an intuition for what's likely to work well in a particular context. But it's really hard to encapsulate that information into clear-cut rules. The things that I'll give you are sort of rules of thumb related to some of these different approaches. So regression-based approaches tend to work really well with structured data. In particular, geographic clusters are easily accounted for in generalized linear mixed models. So if you've got problems that, or if you've got sort of a small field data set that is restricted to a small part of the domain you want to predict over, then some of these regression-based methods are actually really appropriate, and they're going to deal with uncertainty much better than some of the other methods are. The downsides here is that they're actually not that great at fitting high-dimensional interactions, and they tend to overfit when you give them lots and lots of covariates. So if you have a few hundred observations and you have a few dozen potential features, chances are these regression-based methods are going to overfit. Tree-based methods are fast, and they tend to be really good at fitting thresholdy relationships, but they sometimes will give you artifacts, and they're really, really good at overfitting. So there are a variety of different techniques that we can use to minimize that overfitting, but like inevitably you're going to come up with a model that that does a really, really good job on your training data, regardless of how well it does on independent data. That's something to work with. Vector-based methods like SVM are really good at understanding those high-dimensional interactions, but they also tend to provide some artifacts, and it's also like the methods for quantifying uncertainty in SVM predictions are actually not very good. At least with the packages that I've used, I tend to get funny uncertainty estimates from SVM. Neural networks are really great with big data. So the larger neural network models will basically continue to improve if you keep adding data, whereas some of the other models tend to, the performance tends to asymptote as you add more samples. Neural networks are just like, bring it on, man. Give me tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of data points. I can deal with the complexity. The flip side of that is that oftentimes they actually really need big data sets to perform really well, at least better than the traditional approaches. So that means that if you have a small data set, neural networks are not necessarily going to give you much benefit. They can be slow to fit, and they can be slow for inference, depending on how complicated the models are. And they tend to rely on a very large stack of installed software. So that induces some problems with reproducibility. It's very likely that if you're using a deep neural network, you're going to update some obscure piece of software on your computer, some Python package, and it's going to break the whole workflow, requiring you to reinstall everything. And that does not make for nice and portable and reproducible models. I'd say that there's like definitely progress on this, but we're still in a point where particularly deep neural networks are, they're a little bit harder to incorporate into standard scientific workflows than some of the other models. And then finally, geostatistical models are really great with sparse geographic data. They will take into account spatial relationships explicitly. They don't tend to scale super well. So if you have tens or hundreds of thousands of training samples, those tend to be really slow to fit and really slow for inference. They sometimes can also lead to over-smoothed predictions where you've got models that have artifacts that are associated with the distance from a training point, and that's for the most part not that you don't always see that, but you sometimes do. I will say that you can sometimes combine geostatistical approaches like Kriging with some of these other approaches, and that leads to hybrid approaches called regression Kriging or machine learning Kriging that can sometimes give you the best of both worlds. Okay, so that's the model zoo. A couple of approaches that I want you guys to pay attention to going forward. These are approaches that aren't necessarily the easiest or most straightforward or most productive to implement approaches, but they're things that people are going to be using a lot more in the next few years. The first is fast convolutional networks for multispectral data. This is something like, there's a paper by Morales et al. Describing an approach called Hyper 3D Net. This is one of the best performing convolutional neural networks, or ConvNets, that works with hyperspectral data. So these neural networks were originally developed for ordinary photographs with only 3 spectral bands. And they tended to not generalize super well to situations in which you've got a lot of spatial features. So that could mean satellite imagery where you've got 8 or 10 spectral bands, or it could mean situations like we often see where we're trying to combine spectral and spatial features or spectral and structural features. These deep neural networks tended just not to learn very much from that spectral or structural information. That's starting to change, where we're seeing models that are performant on multispectral data or hyperspectral data, and they're also fast enough to be practical to implement across large landscapes. They're still sort of in that place where they're a little bit more difficult to implement than some of the other approaches that I talked about, but these are definitely sort of the way of the future in terms of statistical prediction using machine learning and remote sensing. The other thing that I wanted to raise was that there's been a lot of progress recently in combining statistical and ecological process models. And these are taking, in some ways, the best of both worlds in terms of they've got explicit representations of important biological processes, but they're also using statistical or machine learning or kriging tools to give better predictions in situations where there's like a bias in the process model, things like that. So one of the great examples I found of this is a paper by Jim Clark and colleagues recently, where they're using a combination of a statistical model with a forest growth model to understand changes to forests with climate change. This is just a really clever way that they've done spatial prediction in a way that respects our understanding of ecological processes, but also generates the kind of accurate predictions we might expect from a purely statistical approach. Just something to watch. All right, so before I launch into the case study, I want to talk about some common missteps with geographic prediction. And the first is really inadequate training data. And you can sort of never have enough training data. You'll always get better predictions if you have more data. But it's not quite as simple as that. And that's that really what we're talking about is feature coverage. So if you've got a really small sample size, chances are it's not going to cover a lot of the combinations of environments that you might desire prediction in. But even if you have a large sample size, that doesn't necessarily guarantee feature coverage. So here are two hypothetical data sets that have the same size but different amounts of coverage. So in this case, the blue dots are the measured locations, and the gray dots are unmeasured locations. So on the left side, we've got a situation where we've got a pretty representative sample. It's we're getting samples from where the bulk of the data is, but we're not getting samples from the statistical tails of the distribution of either the x variable or the y variable. So this is sort of one of those instances where if you've got environments that are out in the tails of the distribution, they're essentially goats in trees to the model. So it's not going to perform very well where it doesn't have training samples. On the right-hand side, we've got a collection of samples that's the same size and is a little bit less representative of the larger landscape, but covers the features, the feature space better. So it has the representations in the extremes of the distribution of x and y, and that's going to prevent some of the worst kind of goats and trees problems with prediction. A really big misstep that we see with machine learning specifically is something called non-stationarity. And that's what happens when the statistical relationships between your target and the features change either over space or through time. So the most famous example of this non-stationarity is with a machine learning project called Google Flu Trends. This was a project that Google did in the early 2000s that was using Google search results to predict the incidence of seasonal flu in the United States. And in 2009 and 2010, they released this tool, which was considered at that time really amazing. So it was able to, just based on the spatial distribution of people's search results, which regions of the United States people were searching for things like flu symptoms, they were able to back out through a machine learning approach what the incidence of flu was, and it just matched up with CDC's disease surveillance data. Awesome. So here's what happened to the predictions in 2012 and 2013, however. So they fit a model once, and then they just ran it. And what they found over time, their performance started to degrade. So by the bad flu outbreak that happened in 2012, it was over predicting by a factor of 2 the incidence of flu compared to the CDC's surveillance estimates. This is what's happened when the system is non-stationary. Essentially, the relationship between people having flu symptoms and doing a Google search about flu symptoms changed in some important way between 2010 and 2012. And that non-stationarity in the system caused a really big error in prediction. So that's an example of through time, but I'm also going to talk about an example over space in a minute. Okay, the final misstep that I'll talk about is scope and scale mismatch. And I'll go back to that example of of soil grids, that like wonderful global data set of soil properties. And this is an example of that data set. I guess this is the percent silt across North America. And then I'm going to zoom in on that data set just for the Gunnison Basin. And you can see really important spatial patterns of silt in soil at the continental scale. But if you zoom into the scale that's more relevant to local data, there's just like not much variability there. And that's not because there's not much variability on the landscape. There certainly are silt-rich soils and silt-poor soils in this landscape. But the pixels are 1 kilometer wide, and the covariates that they're using to predict silt just don't have much relationship with silt in this particular part of the study area. So that scale and scope mismatch can really mess people up when they take these large scale predictions and they try and apply them in contexts that are at a different scale or different scope than the original predictions. This is just a beware kind of thing. Okay, so I'm going to go through this workflow in practice, and we're going to move pretty fast, but I'm going to try and cover most of the major workflow steps that I talked about in the previous part of the analysis. And the case study I'm really looking at is trying to predict vegetation deciduousness from airborne imagery and LiDAR data in the Upper Gunnison Basin. So the Upper Gunnison Basin has a mixture of evergreen and deciduous forest types. This is that hillside that I showed you before that shows a mixture of open meadow, shrubland, quaking aspen, and spruce fir stands. This is a pretty heterogeneous landscape, and we're trying to understand the spatial patterns and processes using a variety of different remote sensing tools, including imagery from satellites. So this is an image of what's called a normalized differential snow index. It's essentially a spectral feature that's related to the amount of snow that's on the surface. And we can see some intriguing patterns here that are potentially related to the pattern of snow cover in March, but they're also potentially related to the pattern of evergreen tree cover, because NDSI is not just sensitive to snow, it's also sensitive to evergreen forest canopy. And if we want to correct for this, if we want to understand something about snow accounting for canopy, we need to know something about the deciduousness of the forest around here. Now, there are land cover products that we can use to work this out, but unfortunately, they're actually not very good at distinguishing deciduous and evergreen canopies in this part of Colorado. And I think part of the reason is that this is a challenging place to do space-based remote sensing. There's a lot of clouds, and the season is really short. And so that means that it's likely to confuse things like aspen with other deciduous cover types like meadow or shrubland. Yeah, so that has pushed us to developing our own land cover map, which is going to be at 1 meter resolution, much finer scale than the other potential approaches. But we're going to need a machine learning model to help us out. So I'm going to go through the major workflow steps here to getting to a well-performing deciduousness model using aerial imagery and LiDAR. And I'm going to focus really on this relatively new framework for fitting machine learning models called tidy models. This is a set of R packages that provides standardized interfaces to many commonly used machine learning toolboxes. And it's actually fantastic software developed by one of the lead developers at RStudio, a guy named Max Kuhn. And I think makes it much easier to take a diverse set of machine learning models and apply the same training, tuning, and evaluation workflow to them. So that's what I'm focused on today. But before we get on with that, I'm going to pause really briefly and ask whether we've got any questions here. Okay, yeah, so Natalia's got a question. Do you need the transformed features in order to reduce the dimensionality of the data? That's a great question. So remember, when we're talking about transforming features, there's sort of a variety of different mathematical transformations we could potentially use. And one of those is a data reduction technique. So something like principal component analysis could take dozens or hundreds of spectral or structural features and reduce it to a much smaller number of features. In practice, that's going to make a difference for some machine learning approaches and not for others. So regression-based approaches tend to not work very well with very large numbers of predictors. And in that case, data reduction can make a big difference. But some of the tree-based methods are really good at sorting out which predictors are useful, which ones are not, and dealing with predictors that covary strongly. So in that situation, it doesn't matter as much. There's usually not a huge benefit to doing feature reduction unless you've got a very large number of features that are super strongly correlated with each other. A good example would be hyperspectral data, where you've got lots and lots of spectral bands that are, in some cases, almost entirely correlated with each other. In that case, data reduction is really useful for some of those machine learning algorithms to work well. But the flip side is that you can sometimes actually throw away useful information by doing those data reduction techniques. But that's a great question, Natalia. Awesome. So I'm going to move over to QGIS and show you a little bit more about this this deciduousness problem. Okay, so oops, let me make sure that I am sharing my screen. Okay. All right, so this is the Upper Gunnison Basin in western Colorado. You can see the city of Gunnison down here below. And the domain that I work in is really this kind of triangular region that's upstream of the city of Gunnison. And like we were seeing on the hillside before, it's a variety of different forest types. And the data sets that are available, at least at the scale we're interested in, are actually quite cool. So this is an aerial image from the National Aerial Imagery Program. It's a freely available USDA source of data. That's an airborne camera that flies over and takes pictures. In this case, the data was collected in September of 2019. So this is the community of Crested Butte South that you can see down in the valley bottom. And in September 2019, both the coniferous trees and also the aspen are still bright green. This is before these trees have really turned their fall colors. By chance, we also have information from the National Aerial Imagery Program from October of 2017, and that's actually after most of this vegetation has turned, deciduous vegetation has browned down. So I'm going to flip on the October 2017 NAPE image, and you can see now the aspen is super easy to pick out in the imagery here. So we've got conifer trees that are dark green still, and for the most part, the aspen is yellow, although there are some patches here that are still green. So this is promising, right? It tells us that there might be spectral features, color features that we can use to distinguish between evergreen and deciduous trees in this landscape. But before we get too excited about this, I want to talk a little bit about non-stationarity. That was that problem with Google Flu Trends data that caused predictions to break down over time. This is an example of spatial non-stationarity, and what I'll do is actually go from this mid-elevation environment and zoom out a little bit and head down to low elevation environments around the city of Gunnison. These are about 2,000 feet lower in elevation, and they have a much longer growing season. So if we zoom in on some of the cottonwoods down here by the Gunnison River, we can see that even really late in the season, this is in mid-October, those cottonwoods really haven't changed their, they haven't gotten their fall color. They haven't really changed much spectrally. So we've got the situation where at high elevations, almost all of the deciduous vegetation has turned to yellow or dropped off completely. But down at lower elevations, it hasn't. And that means that the contrast between deciduous and evergreen vegetation in feature space might change as a function of elevation. So that's actually a big problem that we had to deal with in the course of this doing this analysis, and it had a fairly simple solution, and that was just include an elevation map as a predictor in this analysis. And what that allowed the algorithms to do is to learn learn the non-stationarity, learn the difference between deciduous and evergreen at high elevation and deciduous and evergreen at low elevation. And the ultimate upshot here is that we've been able to develop a pretty accurate 1 meter resolution land cover map for this whole domain. And this is a pretty complicated project that's involved half a dozen or so different machine learning models. So we're just going to focus on the evergreen versus deciduous part of this land cover problem today, and that's a much simpler problem conceptually, but still allows you to go through the full machine learning workflow. So I'm going to head over to RStudio. And if you guys want to follow along, the code and all the data is up on the GitHub site. I will say that you'll have to install quite a few external libraries or packages to make everything work. Although I decided not to have you guys install the major neural network software, TensorFlow and Keras, mostly because I was only able to get it working on half of the machines that I have access to, and I figured that I would save everybody some frustration. Okay, so we're going to start off by assembling and extracting our features. And I wanted to show you guys those data right here. So what I've done is created a very large sample of deciduous and evergreen points across this landscape. I essentially used random point generator tools in a GIS to give me a large, in this case, about 2,000 points that were either deciduous or evergreen. And then I went to each one and viewed them in the National Aerial Imagery Program data and made a call whether those were deciduous or evergreen. Now, this is a kind of the ideal case for spatial prediction. So I'm able to get a sample across the whole landscape. You'll notice that this is not a uniform sample, so I've been able to oversample some environments like those riparian cottonwoods down at low elevation that were previously a problem. This is one of those things that's actually had some iteration to it. So the training data that I gave you guys is the combination of, I think, 3 different rounds of additional training data that I did to collect data in different parts of feature space. And that's mostly to deal with that non-stationarity problem that we talked about before. Regardless, here's our training data in a GIS, and here's our training data in R. I'm going to go ahead and read that in. This is as a geopackage file, which is a really common format for geographic data. This is point data, but geopackages can also be polygons or other types of data. And we're just going to make a really simple plot with that data that shows the 2 classes that we're trying to predict. So those are coded as 0 and 1, 0 representing not deciduous and 1 representing deciduous. And then I'm going to assemble some features here. And so these are the imagery data sets that I showed you guys before, along with 2 LiDAR-derived structural data sets. One is canopy height in 2019, derived from LiDAR, and elevation also derived from LiDAR. And these are data sets that live in the cloud. So I'm actually just going to add them as cloud-based data sets in R. It's not going to download anything. It's just going to pull the header files or the headers of the files. And the majority of the data is going to stay in the cloud. These data sets are really big. So this is a region of about 70,000 by 80,000 pixels, a few hundred megapixels. And this would be approximately 40 gigabytes if you were to download everything. Luckily, we don't have to. And then the next thing we want to do is extract the values of these features at the points that we use for training. And we're going to use a function called extract here, although it does take quite a while to run. So I'm going to go ahead and skip that step. Instead, I'm going to read in an already extracted data set that is also in the GitHub site. And this is identical to the data set that I just graphed, except now it has the values of the raster data sets at each of those points. The next step is I'm going to fit a baseline model. I'm going to see, are we in the right ballpark in terms of accuracy? And that's what this code does. But first, I'm going to do a little bit of feature engineering on this data. And the reason why I'm doing that is that the baseline model that I want to fit is a GAM, a generalized additive model. And those models tend to not do great with strongly correlated predictors. And with the spectral features we've got, some of those correlations are super strong. Oops, I think I found a bug here. This would be DSID labeled instead of train points. If we want to graph those spectral features, you can see that the green value in 2017 and the red value in 2017 are super strongly correlated with each other. And that could be a problem for analysis. So what we're going to do is just develop a brightness normalized version of both of those variables. So we're going to compute brightness, which is just the sum of all the brightnesses divided by, or sorry, each of those brightnesses divided by their sum. And that's going to generate normalized values that are not as strongly correlated with each other. And that's going to give us a little bit better performance with our model. Next thing we want to do is split the data into training set and a testing set. What I'm doing here by setting the random number generator seed is I'm making sure that each time that I run this script, it's putting the same rows in the training set and the testing set. This is so that I get reproducible results. And then I'm going to fit that generalized additive model. Now, GAM has a very similar interface to other regression modeling approaches in R. It has a formula that has the dependent variable, in this case, train decid, which is a Boolean binary variable with trues and falses. And then it's got collections of predictors wrapped in this function called S, and that's to fit a smooth function. And so if I've got two variables inside the S, that's fitting a two-dimensional smooth function, or essentially an interaction between the two variables that are in here. And I've played around a little bit with the structure of this formula, but I'm not going to dwell on it too much. I'm just going to go ahead and run it. Oh, it would be helpful if I ran the data that, or the code that splits data into training and testing. And then I can fit the model. And this one's fairly fast on 2,000 data points. GAMs can scale to tens of thousands of data points, but it does get quite slow. Simon Wood, the author of this package, has put quite a bit of work into setting up large-scale computation with GAM, so it tends to perform pretty well. And then I get out of here a model summary that's fairly similar to other regression model summaries I might find in R. But I'm not going to worry about the summary too much because I've held out data to see how well it predicts deciduousness on held out data. And so I'm using the predict method there to, for each of the observations in my training and testing data set, I'm predicting in this case, the probability of deciduousness from that data, and then appending it to the original data frame. And this allows me to make some plots. So this is a plot of on the x-axis, the model prediction. In this case, that's the probability of deciduousness. And on the y-axis here is the true class. So the deciduous points are at 1 and the coniferous points are at 0.
Yeah. Could you please show your art console to see the graphs?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to. Are you talking about this console window right here?
Yeah, you're showing we have on the screen so just like QGIS.
Oh my God! Oh, thank you. That is not good. I will change that over. Share. Thank you for stopping me.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so we've got. Now that everybody's with me, thanks. We've got a graph of our prediction on the x-axis and reality on the y. And it looks like, yeah, this model is actually doing pretty well. We've got some points where the predicted probability of deciduous is high, but they're actually conifer points. And we've also got some points that where the predicted probability of deciduousness is low, but we've got deciduous points. So it's not perfect, but seems to work pretty well. You can use this evaluate accuracy function to create what's called a confusion matrix. To actually compute some accuracy statistics from that. So I'll go ahead and create that function. And then I'm going to create a confusion matrix for the training and testing data sets. And what a confusion matrix is simply a table that shows all the contingencies of both real data and predicted class. So in that case, if I just print this GAM test mat. So on the rows here are the true label, and on the columns are the prediction. So it shows us we've got in our testing data set, we've got 200 true negatives. That's where the prediction and the reality are both false. We've got 284 true positives, where the prediction and reality are both positive. And then we've got false positives and false negatives that represent different types of misclassification there. And it looks like there are actually more false negatives than there are false positives here. That's something to keep in mind. Okay, so regardless, it looks like we've got accuracies here that are somewhere between 80 and 90%. Just in our baseline model. So we haven't done much tuning, we haven't done much to the data, and we're already sort of at the place where we're getting pretty close to our target. I really want all of the classes in my land cover map to be more than 95% accurate. So we're definitely not there, but we're in the right ballpark. And that means that it's worthwhile to continue going forward with the prediction. So the next part of this code is going to fit, tune, and assess multiple machine learning models using that tidy models framework. And the two other kinds of models, I'm going to use the GAM model that we just fit, but I'm also going to use a model that's fit with a boosted regression tree approach using a package called XGBoost. And I'm going to use a support vector machine model fit with a library called KernLab. And the tidy models package will give a uniform interface to both of those packages. So we essentially get to reuse the same code to fit the gradient boosted and SBM models. So I can do read data in and split it into a training and testing set, just like we did before. And then things get a little bit different. So instead of doing the feature engineering kind of outside in our ordinary R environment, Tidy Models has you set up a recipe for transforming the data. And that's a reproducible workflow. It's essentially a function you apply to a data frame that's going to apply all the data transformations, all the feature engineering that you have, and it's going to package it up into a single function called a recipe. And the important thing is that is going to allow us to apply the exact same data transformation to different subsets of our data when we're doing cross-validation, and also with different modeling frameworks, making sure that we've got the same training data and testing data in all cases. So once we set up a recipe, we're going to use a function called bake to apply a recipe to data. So in this case, I'm going to create two new data frames, train baked and test baked, that represent the transformed data that's been held back for testing, and the transformed data we want to use to fit models. All right, the next step is tuning. So most machine learning models have hyperparameters. Think of these as knobs you can twist that change how the learning process happens. So for gradient boosted models, the first ones that I'm looking at, some of those hyperparameters represent the number of trees, the learning rate, the tree depth, how much loss reduction to apply. And I'm actually not going to go into what those hyperparameters are, but just know that what values you choose can affect how effective your classification is. And it's oftentimes difficult to choose a priori the best hyperparameters. So instead, what we want to do is try a bunch of different combinations and see which ones work best. And that's what this code does. So essentially, we're going to create a specification for tuning that specifies what the different values of those hyperparameters are. So the grid underscore regular function is going to create a regular grid of hyperparameters. This is actually a data frame that that has all the different combinations of variables that it's going to try. And then it's going to set up cross-validation to fit every combination of these hyperparameters with different subsets of the data held back for testing. And that's going to allow us to evaluate how well the models do on data that was held out. Then it's going to collect performance metrics it's going to measure the accuracy of the model for each of those different variables of the hyperparameters. And so this is something that actually takes a few minutes to run. So I'm going to skip over this. But just know that if you really want to do a thorough job of tuning your models, and that can make sometimes a moderate to large difference in how well they perform, you're going to want to get it to run, essentially like set it up to run overnight and do a good job of tuning the hyperparameters. And then so finally what it's going to do is it's going to take all those different possible tunings, and it's going to figure out which one gives the best predictions, and then it's going to refit the final model with all of the training data instead of doing the cross-validation procedure. And then it's going to we're going to save that final fit object to disk. And I'm actually going to read it back because I went through this earlier. Oops, that's another path issue. Oh, name something different. Fit. Nope. Not fur. Fit. There we go. All right. Okay. So we're able to do that for the gradient boosted model. And let's look at how well it performs with the testing data set. So this is with a training data set. So this is a confusion matrix, just like we were looking at before, except it's with the training data, not independent data that's held out. And so this is actually performing spectacularly well on the training data, but that's no surprise because these kinds of tree-based approaches tend to overfit. So the real proof in the pudding is going to come later when we compare it to a held out data set. So we've got essentially identical code that goes into tuning a support vector machine model. And I'm going to skip over that because it takes a few minutes and just load the final data set in. And again, we can evaluate it against the training data. And it looks like it performs maybe not quite as well on the training data as the gradient boosted model does, but still quite good. But the real I guess the proof is in the pudding is going to be comparing against data that we've held back. So that's what this code does. I'm also going to refit the generalized additive model using the set of predictors that we prepared using that bake function. And then we can compare them. So I'm going to actually skip ahead here because we're running a little short on time down to sort of the final evaluation for all these different modeling approaches. So it might take a few seconds. All right. So it looks like we've got accuracies between 88 and 89.7%. Sorry, 85 to 89.7% for those different approaches. And one of the things that we can do to maybe improve our predictions a little bit is by ensembling the models or averaging their predictions. And if we do that, it turns out it boosts our accuracy even more, just a tiny bit. Oh, actually, I think that looks like it's the same as one of the as the highest performing model. In many situations, doing that kind of ensembling can improve your predictions. So moving on to large scale prediction, we're going to sort of assume that these are the best possible models, and we're going to go forward with spatial prediction based on those. And this is going to essentially try and predict our model on the whole landscape. And that's going to be slow. Remember, this is hundreds of millions of locations that we're going to try and predict on. But just to get started, I'm gonna focus on just a teeny tiny little part of our study area. And what I'm gonna do is take that tiny little extent and I'm gonna break it into tiles. In this case, tiles of 1,000 by 1,000 pixels. That's what that tile scheme function does. We can actually plot those tiles on top of the map there, or we can plot them separately. Yep, so we've got 4 different tiles that look like they're different sizes and shapes with respect to the tiny little area that I clicked on. But now I'm gonna go through and make a spatial prediction for each of those tiles. And I'm almost out of time, so I'm really gonna blaze through this. But what it does is it takes each of those potential predictor raster data sets, and it extracts just the information for that tiny little area that's encapsulated by the tile. It's going to transform that into a data frame, make run the prediction method for each of those models, and then store that information back as a raster tile. And so what you're going to end up with, if you were to do this for the whole data set, is a few thousand, about 4,000 of those tiles, which you can then mosaic together into a continuous data set. I'm going to go back to QGIS and just actually show you a result from letting this run. It takes about an hour on a modest sized subset of the area, so I'm not going to let it run now. I'm just going to add the mosaic back in. So this is a VRT file. So that's a virtual raster. It's just an index file that puts all those tiles in the right place so it looks like a continuous data set. And I can zoom in there. And after a minute or two, we should see our, associated coordinate system. Great. Okay, so this is our spatial prediction. It's got a few different raster bands here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Band 1, 2, and 3 is the prediction for those 3 different modeling approaches, GAM, SVM, and XGBoost. And then band 4 is the just arithmetic average between those. So I'm just going to visualize that band 4 from black to white. And I give it limits of 0 to 10,000. I've rescaled the predicted probabilities from 0 to 1 to 0 to 10,000 so that the output files can be a little bit smaller. And yeah, this allows us to zoom in and see how we did. All right, so this actually looks pretty good. So we've got conifer stands that we can see on Google Maps and aspen stands. And for the most part, aspen is aspen, conifer is conifer. But you'll notice that there are some misses here. In particular, there are a lot of pixels that are in conifer that are classified as aspen. And there are a few areas that are aspen classified as conifer. So I wouldn't necessarily put this at production ready. And actually, for the full analysis, we went back and added a few more extra geographic predictors. And we also did some post-processing to remove outlier pixels in the final map. But ultimately, that resulted in a map that was about 95% accurate, with a little bit, I guess, a modest amount more effort than what was encoded in just a little example that I showed you guys. So I can again turn on that final classification, which is much cleaner than the initial machine learning model, but has the same basic structure. Okay, so that's just like one little piece of our overall 1 meter land cover map. And it took about 500 lines of code, and to me, it took about a week or so to put together this classification model. But ultimately, I think it's going to be a really useful product. All right, so I think that is about it. I'm essentially out of time, but thank you so much for sticking around, guys. I appreciate y'all having the time, and I'm hoping that you'll join us next time. I guess any questions or comments before we sign off? Natalia, do you have a question?
Yeah, so, well, thank you very much for the workshop. That was very instructive and very cool to see how you did the classification. So I just wanted to, I asked you before, but I'm really interested in that paper that you mentioned, the Clark et al. 2021, about like mixing like the ecological processes with some statistical models. And I don't know if you could share the title, because I tried to Google it and I couldn't find it.
Oh yeah, I think it's a relatively new paper, but it's in the references on the slides. So I can show you that. So here's the reference, and then these slides are going to be up on the GitHub site, so you can always reference them later.
Okay.
Continent-wide tree fecundity driven by indirect climate effects.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop that recording. And thanks, everyone.